The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Closer, closer, closer. Closer.
If I sit up straight, I'd actually be right on mic, but because I'm a chronic sloucher, because I had 5 kids and no longer have core.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Piki mai, kaki mai, tēnā koutou katoa. This has gone by lunchtime. It's the morning of Monday, June 19, 2023. I'm Toby Manhire. With me are Ben Thomas and Annabelle Lee-Mather. You may know us by our stage names, Wet, Whiny and Inward-looking. Thanks to producer Te Aihe Butler, and thank you to our benefactors and our muses, the spin-off members. Today, we're going to talk about gangs and gangs and gangs. We're going to talk about the scrap for the rural vote, the Greens tax policy, Meng Foon if we get time. But first, let's talk about recession. We've been talking about recession for a long time. Will there be a recession? Won't there be a recession? The economy shrank by 0.1% in the quarter to March, which means 2 in a row, which sounds the recession bell. Grant Robertson said it was in large part caused or tipped over the mark by the cyclone and by the Auckland floods. Nicola Willis said it was a red light warning and the result of economic mismanagement. Ben, it's also what Adrian Orr wanted, isn't it? So in a way, things are going swimmingly. It's a shallow recession.
It is a shallow recession in that nobody's reflected or learned anything. Recessions are really interesting because a lot of the headlines came through like New Zealand is now officially in recession, but we don't know that. What we do know is that New Zealand was officially in recession.
Right.
In the March quarter.
Unless they adjust it, which they did the quarter before. So maybe we could, if they adjusted it towards 0, then we could have not been in recession after all.
Well, that's right. But right now, it seems as if we were in recession in March. We may or may not be in recession now.
No, probably
and it really is kind of, one of those like very postmodern sort of things where we're sort of like, well, how are you coping with last quarter's recession so far?
Yeah.
It is sort of interesting that, the numbers play such an important part. The government doesn't want this number saying that we're in a recession in the same way that, there's been some talk that they scheduled the return of the fuel excise or the dropping of the fuel excise subsidy so that the newly imputed inflation figure wouldn't come out until after the election. Now, whether that's true or not, it's sort of, statistically convenient for the government because there is kind of a psychological power in these statistical indicators.
Right. It's a bit like sometimes people talk about something hitting 1,000 or 1,000,000 just because it's a round number. It's not meaningfully different from one fewer, but it feels different, right?
That's right. If we had discovered that we weren't in a technical recession, for the first 3 months of this year, would that have meant that our sort of, our qualitative experience of it would have been any different? And no, but this allows National to sort of say it's a flashing red light, whereas, a deep recession, of course, would see much more sort of public conjecture about the nature of things and,
But it's also true, isn't it, that those of us who are old enough to remember a deep recession and, the shops, sort of empty shops and general, like proper malaise, it's not good. There is a cost of living crisis, but it's not that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's always a bit funny. There was, during the GFC, which was the last sort of, kind of hefty sort of recession here. I remember it was around the same time that I went into the public sector to sort of weather the effects of recession, and I when I arrived down in Wellington,
Cocooned in the public sector.
You're thinking the same now? Is that what you're saying?
It's always got to remain an option. I understand there's a few vacancies have come up, but I think when I moved down to Wellington, I was reading a copy of the Dominion Post, and it said, well, it doesn't feel like we're in a recession. All the cafes are full, people are still spending. And I'm like, well, that's obviously true in Lambton Quay, right? State sector salaries haven't been cut. So, again, it really depends on who you're talking to, because in a shallow recession, some parts of the economy are hit much harder than others. Some parts of the economy are doing just fine. And so it really depends who you're talking to. And I suppose that's one reason why the numbers are so important, because if you were just sort of looking out your window, depending on where you are, you might not notice it at all.
Do you think it makes a difference with an election roaring towards us, Annabelle?
I think that for large segments of New Zealand society, they kind of live in a permanent state of recession. Cost of living and the cost of living crisis is like a sliding scale. So I don't know if it really makes a huge amount of difference if you're in technical recession or not. I think it's probably more important for the politicians in terms of the way they craft the narrative. But it is, I understand, forecast to end in the next quarter, which falls before the election. So there's an opportunity for Labor to pump up their own tyres and talk about what a great job they've done of navigating the economy through COVID.
I mean, it does, doesn't it, kind of show up that, people say technical recession, and I guess sometimes you have to be careful with that as a politician, because you don't want to sound as though you're trying to minimise the reality of it. But at the same time, if there had been, if the economy had grown by 0.3% and then fallen by 0.9%, that would be worse than we wouldn't have had a recession, but the economy would have been in a smaller place.
I think the numbers that most voters tend to watch aren't the ones that are coming out about 0.1 or whatever. It's more like the cost of groceries, the cost of filling up the car, all of those sorts of things. And at the moment, they're still going up.
And the other thing, that so far there hasn't been any real effect on employment, and that's what tends to mark out the real sort of human misery of recessions, as as we popularly understand them, which is people lining up for food parcels and getting turfed out of work, in small towns being sort of, having their main industries shut down. And they've so far so far we've largely avoided that, which
has put us into recession. The recession is the cost of keeping the economy pumping enough that you don't have massive unemployment.
And then trying to avoid stagflation. So if Adrian was timed it right, then the great golden goose of the New Zealand economy, the housing market, will start to recover and everything will be sunny again. Let's talk about gangs. It's election year, and it's as reliable as writ day and rosettes as politicians talking about cracking down on gangs. Ōpōtiki in the Bay of Plenty was the focus for much of the week just gone. The president of the mongrel mob Barbarians was killed, suspected to be a rival gang hit. And his tangi was in town, which are an influx of gang members and a whole lot of police as well. And the town coming to a standstill in some parts, schools closed.
A few shootings, bit of fire.
Some fire. And the politicians were all over it. And Chris 1 and Chris 2 competed to be more cross with the gangs. David Seymour used the word subhuman and compared Ōpōtiki to Mogadishu. Rawiri Waititi and the Ōpōtiki Mayor David Moore both said, stop turning all of this into a political football. What did you make of the coverage and the debate?
Well, I think that the Mayor probably has a better understanding of what's going on than the two Chris's. I thought it was interesting that the media seemed to be much more preoccupied with what was going on at the tangi than the actual murder itself. Lest we forget, he was actually a murder victim. And there was a really good article and stuff over the weekend that talked about Steve and his mahi in the community, how he had recovered from P and was working with the local te whakatohia social service provider on anti-meth campaigns and that sort of thing. I think when what I found interesting about the media coverage was doing a comparison with other gang-related funerals that have been held over the years. And one example came to mind, which was Conor Morris, and the stark difference in the way his funeral and procession was reported by comparison to what happened with Steve's. It seemed to be far more empathetic to him as a murder victim. It talked a lot more about, gangs and rival gangs coming to pay their respects, whereas in the case of Ōpōtiki, it felt far more historical. It's also frustrating that, when we report on gang issues, that we tend to ignore the underlying reasons that gangs were able to blossom in places like Ōpōtiki in the first place, and also the other issues that are going on in communities like that, like massive housing crisis there. The housing crisis is a result of the mussel farm that's been established through the Regional Development Fund, which is a good thing, that they've got this employment opportunity that's about to happen, but there hasn't been the extra investment around it so that locals don't get pushed out. So it's a shame in my view that there was such a narrow focus on just the gang funeral and the procession, and not some wider analysis of what's happening in small towns like Ōpōtiki, where there is a lot of gang membership.
Ben, the National Party came out yesterday, on Sunday, with a new policy that would make membership of a gang an aggravating factor in sentencing, which, as many pointed out quickly, is already the case. The difference being that it's different. Well, it's different insofar as it doesn't need to be linked. You don't need to have been operating as part of the gang in the offence for it to be an aggravating factor.
So currently, if your gang plans a robbery and then you are convicted, then your membership of the gang is, that's an aggravating factor. Or if you do something as a crime in order to be a gang initiate, that's part of your hazing or whatever, that's an aggravating factor. Here they're saying if you're a gang member, you get into a scuffle in town, you're convicted. The fact that you're a gang member makes that as an aggravating factor.
Irrespective of the crime. So, for example, should we have as an aggravating factor driving a double cab ute around Ponsonby if it's never touched mud? I mean, we could add all sorts of different things as aggravating factors.
Driving a double cab ute around Ponsonby should just be a crime. We need to criminalise it first. Make it strict liability. so just being in the driver's seat is enough for a conviction. But the rationale for this, and look, I think the
rationale for this was to get the national cracks down on gangs on the 6 p.m. news, which happened.
Well, sure, but but think about whether there's a justifiable philosophical sort of rationale for it. What they've said is that because we know that fear of crime is not as much, but for some people more of an erosion of like lifestyle and well-being as crime itself. If you're genuinely in fear of crime every waking hour, your life will not be enjoyable, right? And so that's one of the reasons that everything is a little bit wider than punishing people, individually for each particular crime.
Do we if you're scared of crime but you live in a place where there's actually no gang members, is it really as much of an impact on your quality of life?
I think, in a subjective sense, I think it can be. But I think what you're talking about more is sort of areas where gang activity is rife. What is that, and we all know this, right? If patched gang members go up and start intimidating somebody in public, the patch is part of the intimidation, right? That's what the patch is for. The patch is to say, don't fuck with me. I think
the patch is to symbolise membership.
Of a criminal street gang, okay,
and so, that also has the thing of intimidating people.
And so the rationale for this policy is that any time gang members commit crimes against the public, what they're doing is increasing the kind of aura of intimidation, of fear, of impunity, that the gangs have. And that's why it's an aggravating factor. If an individual gang member gets into a fight in town, hurts somebody, that adds to the generalized fear of patched people wandering around the town, right? So, I mean, you can say, it's not 100% robust, but, you can see a kind of a general philosophical thrust there. I think there's about a 0% chance the courts would apply it. Be the same thing as 3 strikes. They would start arguing and whittling it down under sort of Bill of Rights implications. But yeah, look, they got on the 6 p.m. news. A lot of confusion. I noticed that one news said, "Oh, this is already the law." They bought into the Labour line there. Labour had 2 lines: one that it's already the law, and 2 that it's a gross overstepping of human rights and a terrible policy, which is always like a very funny response for things by a government, which is that it's a bad idea and we're already doing it.
I mean, there is another.
That, the thing is that this policy is actually not going to make anyone any safer, and it's not going to deter anyone from joining a gang. And it's a shame because, there are significant gang issues in places like the Bay of Plenty on the Hui. We did a story last year about a young dad who had gone to a whanaunga's 21st and was murdered by a young mobster. And this policy would have done nothing to help save his life or to discourage that offender from doing what he did. I think if we really want to talk about making people safer and making communities safer, we need to look at the whakapapa of gangs. We need to work alongside gangs. We need to take a far more holistic, not just a punitive approach, because in a lot of those communities, the gangs are the only show in town. There's not a whole lot of jobs or business or anything like that going on. The only way to earn a living is to be a part of them or to have a sense of, comradeship with those people. So, how do we begin to do that as a society and have those discussions? Because ramping up fear and outrage from Queen's Arcade does nothing to help people that live in those communities.
I think it's important to note, though, that this isn't all just, hysterical fear-mongering. It is true that the police blocked off State Highway 2 for most of a whole day so that a gang funeral could go through, so that they could ride on both sides of the road, so that they could rev their bikes, so that they could, have the road to themselves. I mean,
Isn't that what farmers do when they block up all the streets when they do their tractor protests? Or
What about just moving sheep around? Are those sheep patched? I mean, that's a question for everyone.
Well, no, look, sure, but I mean, well, yeah, sure. I mean, and you could argue that everybody should have that right when a loved one dies, that they get the whole motorway to themselves, right? Fair enough. But, nobody denied that, shots were fired, that gang tensions were high, that people were scared. The mayor didn't deny people were scared. He just said, "Oh, it's up to the schools if they want to close." I understand everyone's on edge.
I mean, I guess
now, of course, the mayor is interested in trying to lower tensions and doesn't want it to turn into a big shemozzle in his town. Of course, he wants that because he has to deal with it, right? Because the government aren't going to deal with it. They're just going to invite the national spokespeople for gangs.
Well, I think the other thing too, which he talked about in some of his interviews, is that while it's easy to call these people subhuman, they are in fact human and they have to live somewhere. And if they're living somewhere, you want them to be an active part of the community and contributing positively towards it. And he talked about that. He talked about, an old lady fell over on the main street and a gang member rushed to her aid and helped her up. Someone's car got a flat tyre and it was a gang member who, with a broken arm, who helped them put the new tyre on. There's been people talking about how when there was a a strike in Wairoa. It was the mongrel mob down there who were running a food bank and helping to support families and stuff through it. So, you can't just write them off as subhuman because they're not.
Yep.
You have to find a way to bring them into the wider community and offer them a better gig than what's currently.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, the thing is, the people who are victims of gangs are by and large gang members. Because the thing is, in towns like Ōpōtiki, Wairoa, places like that, these aren't blinged up sort of Harley Davidson riding, personal gym owning guys. These people they're not living good lives, right? As we know, the gang leader was a victim of violence himself.
Yeah, well,
right?
Morgan Godfrey made the very good point that that unlike other gangs that are centred around business or an enterprise, mongrel mob members and Black Power members, they tend to be unified through a common experience, and the whakapapa of that common experience is being wards of the state, and then that's become an intergenerational thing where you're born into a gang whānau and so it goes.
Yeah, but which doesn't mean that the culture around it is good, right?
No, but I think the other point that Morgan made, which I think is an important one, is that the focus needs to be providing, as Morgan put it, off ramps for people who are in those situations, rather than adding more on ramps, and some criminalising and sending people to prison. Likely is basically a very good finishing school for becoming a gang member. Let's move on. The rural vote has been another real focus over recent times. ACT have sort of had the running on it. They've got Mark Cameron, who's been one of their most effective MPs, who likes to remind everyone he's the only working farmer in Parliament. They signed up Andrew Hoggard, which was in many ways like a kind of classic. Looks like he'd been produced by a 3D printer for a National Party MP of the 1980s, it seems to me. He's sort of smart and reasonably, he's got reasonably good wry humour, all that sort of stuff, and obviously knows the sector.
The Fed Farmers pedigree,
The Fed Farmers pedigree.
The militant wing of the National Party.
Then National sort of responded to that. It came out with a policy sort of opening the door towards GMO and farming, which seemed quite forward-thinking, and hats off to Judith Collins for leading that. And then the second part of it was, as had been teased a bit in advance, was riding back from another cross-party accord after the housing density one a couple of weeks earlier. He Waka Eke Noa is no good for them anymore, and they kicked the old cow burp can down the paddock till 2030. And that was seen very much as an attempt to win back the vote that had fallen away towards ACT. It all played out at field days. Obviously, we were all there at field days. I assume you guys didn't see you there, but I assume we were all there in our red bands. Ben, it seems to me like it's kind of a crucial moment now in terms of whether we see it in a poll or not, I don't know. But this strategy, and tell me if you think this summary is wrong, of trying to win back the vote from ACT, and there are various rationales that are put forward to it. It might be just building the base. It might be because of concern about number of list seats that National would get. Other people have advanced the idea that it's designed to make the prospective coalition look a bit less right-wing by having which is sort of a roundabout way of doing it, becoming more right-wing in order to look less right-wing. I don't know. The risk, of course, is that you could build the National could increase its vote, but the right bloc could become smaller by alienating some people in the middle. Do you think it is? Do you think that that it'll bear fruit, this approach?
Yeah, I think in terms of the agriculture policy, that really is National sort of panicking a bit about their traditional base. Active, I think we've talked about it before. Active been very bullish on their chances in those rural electorates. Their analysis is that farmers didn't turn against National in the last election. They just sort of sat it out. They just weren't enthused enough to come out for anyone. And so they think that that over the last 3 years they've been able to sort of stir that population up. And National, look, it's in the same way as if Labour thought it was losing the unions. This is pretty fundamental stuff for National. It's even if it is a relatively small part of the vote, it's one that's sort of really existential for them.
The backbone.
Yeah, and so I think that I think there was probably a little bit of panic, and you sort of see that in agriculture, more than any other area, they really are very close to ACT. That's agriculture is the one area where they've adopted a sort of ACT-like anti-regulatory policy. The 2 out, 1 in policy for new regulations, which is an old ACT policy.
It sounds like something that Rodney Hyde would have said.
Yeah, that's right. And so they're really trying to close any gap there, because the logic of MMP is that the larger parties should always be going towards the centre, and they should leave the fringe or the edge to their minority partner. National probably are cognizant, though, that ACT is looking like is starting to look like a bigger and more significant partner. If you're providing sort of, if there's a sort of 3-to-1 ratio of major party to minor party, that gives the minor party, a lot of heft. Again, it's like these sort of numbers that they don't mean anything in reality, right? And really, it's the effect on the electorate is essentially the same if National has 58 seats and ACT has 4. In terms
of the way it plays,
as if
but around a cabinet table,
40
it's
and
dramatically
22.
different.
But around the cabinet table, and just in terms of the sort of psychological sort of sense. But it's also the number of ministers that you have who
And David Seymour has been spending a lot of time making it very clear that he is not going to be a lapdog, that he's not going to just go along with things for the sake of a change of government. Right?
That's right. Yeah, and I think ACT saw what happened when they didn't sort of, first of all, when they had no discipline, and secondly, when they didn't differentiate themselves enough from National in 2008 to 2011, where Hyde managed to take them from 5 MPs down to 0. One new one, John Banks. Rationally, National should just be trying to get that exact median voter +1, and that should be what they train all their efforts on. In reality, though, they are jostling for position with ACT because they want to minimise the impact ACT has on their government.
I think what really is freaking National out is the thought that potentially Seymour could get enough votes that he'd be able to leverage or to demand that he gets made Minister of Finance. And I think that's why they keep allowing themselves to get drawn further to the right. I understand why National are smarting over the rural vote because, they lost some key rural electorates last time. But I've heard a lot of people say that although those electorates flipped to Labour, it wasn't because there was like a massive ideological shift in those seats. In fact, a lot of people say that farmers were voting for Labour because they were scared of the Greens having too much sway in a potential government, and the writing was on the wall that Labour was going to win that election. Can I just say too that in terms of kicking cans into the paddock, that's really not good for livestock.
Okay, just make a note about that.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Ōpōtiki, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBit.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Let's talk about as well one of the other news lines of recent times, which was Christopher Luxon. I think it was I think it was up in Helensville when they were announcing the agriculture policy ahead of Field Day, was captured by a camera on a mic saying to somebody that we have become a very negative, wet, whiny, inward-looking country. And I'm quite keen to know your thoughts on that. Go round quickly. Ben, very negative? Yes or no?
Yep.
Annabelle?
Yeah.
Yep. Wet?
Extremely wet.
Extremely wet.
The government's wellbeing framework has done nothing about this winter's wetness.
Yeah.
Been quite wet underfoot. Field Days was quite dry. We all know that
Is
because we were all
Field
there.
Days like matatini for rural Pākehās?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is.
It's like
It's wood chopping.
Glastonbury
It's wood
without
chopping.
any music. You're just in a field.
Like muddy.
Yeah, just
In a
muddy
field.
field.
Whiny, Ben?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
To be honest, I've heard people say all of those things about you two, but they find me delightful.
Inward looking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty inward looking.
Yeah.
So, I mean, correct. He's correct. And
This is one of those...
it's a Kinsley gaff. It's named after Michael Kinsley, who founder of Slate, which is where the gaff is where you say something that everyone knows to be true, but you can't be seen to say. It's one of those.
It's one of those why are you booing me? I'm right kind of moments. I mean, of course he's right. I think this is an interesting feature of Christopher Luxon's leadership, right? Is that he's one of these sort of jonky kind of local boy made good comeback kind of things. But it was really interesting.
You mean he went on a OE and earned lots of money?
Yeah, and then came back. But what was really interesting, he became the leader of the National Party, and he would have these advertisements in an empty stadium and say, "This is how many young people we lost to Australia.
Yeah.
Under my prime ministership, we're going to bring them back." Christopher Luxon, all of his first early speeches as leader about the economy were talking about how we can provide the best opportunity for our kids to go overseas and make it over there. So he came back and he was like, "I care about you all so much. I'm going to help you get out of here."
Did Luxon say that before or after he went to Field Days?
It was before.
Oh, was it? Because if he said that after Field Days, it'd be kind of justified.
Hipkins had a very workshopped gag, which was nevertheless quite effective, which said, I haven't seen anyone here who's negative, wet, whiny, and inward-looking, but I haven't bumped into Christopher Luxon yet.
That is one feature of Hipkins. He telegraphs his jokes so much. Like when he had done the, spread your legs, which was an amusing, funny gaff thing.
Yeah.
And the next day, he sort of turned up with it on a mug and sort of...
I think people find that quite endearing. I think people find that reasonably endearing.
It wasn't the only mugging that was going on. As he kind of he'd sort of hold it up, kind of taking almost like a tentative sip, but keeping it on camera and sort of raising his brows, hopefully.
I'm really here for those kind of gags.
Yeah. Coming back to the Luxon Key thing, we had Luxon as well with the thing about whether or not people should have more babies, a throwaway remark, which people got very excited about. A few of these sort of things which aren't really big. There was something about John Key. He turned that into a strength because he said, I can't believe these people are getting all hit up. Everybody just he had an ability to shrug it off and bring...
He'd say, I can't. I've had a vasectomy.
Right.
and then that would have been the news cycle for the next week.
Yeah.
And everybody would have forgotten all about the GCSB or whatever they were asking.
That's right. Yeah. That's maybe someone suggesting that to Luxon. We need to forget the Tesla. You need to get the snip, mate.
But again, right, in terms of how mainstream, rate of replacement, reproductive fertility discourse is, it was on the cover of The Economist that week, right? It's an empty swing, but then, they sort of, I think that was an example of, Labor really reaching out way too far on a limb in terms of their efforts to paint him as
I think a lot of women were kind of annoyed by it. I think the thing with Luxon is, as we've already talked about ad nauseum, is because of his spiritual beliefs, there's some tender points around that area, and so some people just feel like it's not a thing that he should be joking about, for the record, I've had 5 kids, so I feel like I've done a lot of heavy lifting in that department.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, but you're a bit like measuring a recession. That's in the past,
That's true. That's true. I know.
Yeah, what have you
I'm
done
in
for us
recession
recently?
until I get a mokopuna.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
This is going to be the second election in a year you haven't reproduced.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to.
Since Waimahia Rose.
Yeah.
Like,
Literally,
fan out
Omiha
the
Pearl,
family
who's
tree.
sitting out there, she was born the day before the election in 1999, and as a newborn bubba, I walked down to the election booth with my brand new baby, thinking I was so neat.
Beautiful. Hey,
no, it was one final thing about Luxon. I kind of think he should have doubled down on it. I feel like part of the problem that he's had with connecting with people is, I mean, he's got to be a hard ass somewhere down there, right? To make it to the top of the corporate ladder,
yeah,
there are certain skills it requires, certain skills it doesn't require, but it requires you to be pretty tough. And I don't sort of believe this sort of, totally self-effacing, I just...
hey, how you doing?
Yeah, like,
Every day.
and when people...
But what if that mode is like really ferocious?
And when
what if steam comes out of his head when he moves into...
I'm scared to see.
He should have doubled down. The thing is, I think just like us, I think most people agreed with him when he said that. And he should have just doubled down and said, yeah, it's true. Stop whining. Be Mayor Quimby off The Simpsons.
Yeah.
I've had it with you people. You're a bunch of fickle mushies.
Instead, the pattern is that he kind of gets sort of... It's a bit like Desley Simpson dragging Wayne Brown off the stage, and then Nicola Willis comes in and says what he meant to say was blah, 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 blah,
and
blah.
instead he should stand up there and say, quit your belly aching. Stop complaining about Christopher Luxon. I'm not the problem here.
Go out there and root New Zealand.
That's right.
That's why we're depressed. That's why we're whiny.
That's right. Be like Newsroom and have some raw politics. It's just... I think that the New Zealand electorate, Helen Clark was the Prime Minister for 9 years. The New Zealand electorate respects somebody who will call them on their bullshit.
Let's talk about the Green Party tax policy, wealth and income policy. I think they call it 45% tax rate on income over 180,000, 2.5% wealth tax on assets over $2 million, asset threshold, something or other, and the idea is there'll be a universal guaranteed income thing, not a UBI quite, but with a $10,000 tax-free threshold, $385 per week for all New Zealanders after a year or two. After all the David Parker stuff, Annabelle, there was the big report. Then there was all of the study into the however many richest New Zealanders it was, putting that capital gains stuff back onto the table. Is this a runner, or do you think Labour will just snuff it out?
I dare say that Labour will try to snuff it out, but depending on what plays out in the election, they might be forced to take on significant tracks of it if they want to govern with the Greens. I like that it says that it can have end child poverty a lot more quickly than the current track that we're on, and it looks like a well thought out policy, I thought.
Yeah, they had all the proper numbers crunched in all sorts of ways. Ben, what do you think?
They look credible.
One of the things that seemed smart about it to me, because we're into this territory now of bottom lines and rulings out and all that sort of stuff that happens in MMP elections, which can be a bit tiresome, but perhaps necessary. The Greens got theirs out kind of early, and at least so that there will be a bit of fresh air for people to talk about it and debate its pros and cons before Labour comes along and goes,
got a good run.
Actually, this is the policy.
Yeah. And it got a good run. It is an internally coherent policy. It sounds pretty well thought out. If you were to look at it, run the numbers as they've suggested, you'd say, yeah, it looks reasonably good. In practice, a wealth tax is sort of fraught with problems in the sense that because you're taxing the same amount, the same wealth every year, you'll find that people will not hold their wealth in New Zealand. They'll make money in New Zealand and then move it overseas, right? But doomed to failure that way. But at the same time, it shows that they're actually taking the policy seriously this time. So I thought, overall a net positive for them.
Net positive.
Again, won't help. It won't help them in terms of Labour adopting it, but
Well, it's one of those things where it's hard to. Typically, you'd imagine in an MMP system were Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori probably have enough to govern that you'd go, well, let's slice off part of this and so on. But the practical politics of it are such that Labour, particularly given what's happened in previous elections, like in 2017, for example, won't be able to do that in a negotiation. They're going to have to set their policy and say, this is the policy, right? It's hard to imagine much room for manoeuvre there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Quickly before we go, Meng Foon.
But they'll probably let somebody from the Greens be the Minister of Recycling.
Meng Foon. They'll allow them to have
Meng Foon. Have we got Meng Foon watch up?
Recycle.
Whether
or not he's actually.
It's like a recession. You don't know whether Meng Foon has resigned or not resigned until 3 months later. He said he hadn't resigned, but it had been.
What?
Well, no, he hadn't resigned. It was on the news this morning. But he'd written a letter to the Prime Minister saying he was about to resign. Which is one of those things you kind of think that's a little bit the head of a pin, Meng.
At the point at which you're 3 days after the minister responsible for you has said you've resigned, irrespective of your personal feelings, you've resigned.
It seems pretty material.
At that point, it's no longer your choice as to whether you've resigned or not.
Just an update on that. I've received from correspondence being explained with it. In fact, I have resigned. I resigned at the end of the first quarter. I've been resigned for many years now. What was it? It was to do with a particular interest in a housing operation while he had been overseeing the Human Rights Commission, involved in the Human Rights Commission.
While he was involved in the Human Rights
housing, and then that came on top, of course, as well of the donations thing, and that it included providing in-kind office space for Kiri Allen's campaign, though that was before she was Justice Minister. Anyway, was this inevitable, Ben? Was this now... I mean, it came out at pub time on a Friday, so a lot of people I don't think noticed it, but did it seem as though there was only one option at that point?
It's the sort of thing where, I've got this rule, anyone can make a mistake once, right? Mm. And a lot of people make one mistake in their political lives. As soon as you find they've made 2 mistakes, you have to get rid of them because there will be infinitely more.
Yeah.
And, no one just makes 2 mistakes. This is the second failure to declare an interest that has been discovered in terms of Meng Foon. At that point, you just you cut your losses. You cut your losses and you accept his resignation, whether he has yet officially tendered it or not.
That's right. It's travelling in the snail mail. Annabelle, Meng Foon's contribution?
Meng's someone that I really admire, obviously from the East Coast. Former mayor, Speaker of Te Reo Māori. Has been a beautiful ambassador for Te Reo Māori. The thing with that job as Race Relations Commissioner, formerly Conciliator, is that the better job you do, the more loathed and despised you are. It really is a poison chalice of a job. And I think Meng was doing a really good job, but I also would have expected him to be politically aware enough that he would need to dot every I and cross every T because you have such a huge target on your back in that role. So for him to make a mistake like this twice in a row, there really is not much of an option but to feel like resigning and then perhaps actually resigning.
That's Annabelle Lee-Mather. Thank you. Thank you, Ben Thomas. Thank you, Te Ahi Butler. I'm Toby Manhire. Thank you. Goodbye. Good night. See you. Bye.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Ōpōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komata o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.